Thanks so much for the very warm welcome and great to see you in such a good crowd. Yeah, so I'm excited to give the talk today and special thanks to Kim for organizing, obviously, to the school for hosting. Well, I've been giving quite a few talks recently, particularly in the UK and now in North America over the next few weeks. I will say this one is particularly special to me because this, the origins of the book really started out during my time here as a PhD student, which, as Kim noted, ended in 2015. And while the book has taken many twists and turns, it took a very long time to craft into its current state. I think it's important to recognize at the core sort of impurities that it's based on. I did under Kim's supervision many years ago here, and I also want to sort of extend a particular words of gratitude to Kim as my PhD supervisor because, yeah, I think she afforded me an enormous amount of latitude to sort of find my own way as a scholar. And also undertake a PhD project that in retrospect maybe was a little bit more ambitious than I realized, but I traveled, to far-flung places in the world and did a lot of things that I don't know if I totally processed what was at stake when I did them. But Kim was an amazing mentor and inspiration in terms of her own work, but also just gave me an enormous amount of latitude to find my own way and find my own voice. And so I'm just incredibly grateful to kind of share how it's all sort of put together in a very long and sort of project that seems to never end, but as now. So yeah, as we both kind of alluded to, my talk today is based on my book that was published late last year, Fabricating Homeland Security, Police Entanglements across India and Palestine in Israel, which was published by Stanford University Press. So the 2008 Mumbai attacks, also known as India's 9/11, or often simply as 26/11, began in the evening of Wednesday, November 26, 2008, when 10 assailants who allegedly traveled from Pakistan via sea entered the city of Mumbai. And the ensuing siege of the city unfolded over the course of the next 68 hours. The assailants attacked police and railway stations, hospitals, luxury hotels, and a popular tourist hangout vehicle cafe, as well as the Jewish cultural center known as Chabad's, the Chabad House, also known as Nerman House. And 26/11 also sparked a major public backlash against the Indian political class and generated pressure to adopt modern homeland security solutions from the global north. The event is widely understood as a major turning point in the ways that matters of domestic security have been imagined and governed in India ever since. And in the book, I trace the corporate and state actors' attempts to capitalize on this event of 26/11 and remake India in the image of homeland security. And these attempts have been underpinned by the rise of a sprawling multi-billion-dollar homeland security industry, which supplies and advises governments and corporations around the world. And while the United States remains the biggest player in this industry and has been for some time, Israel has also emerged as a particularly important node of influence, often understood as a kind of global exemplar or model of security to be emulated by others. And so in the book, I sort of explore what it actually means to be a so-called homeland security model, where such a status originates, and how it works in the world. And I also begin to uncover what actually happens to these so-called security models as they encounter actual places and people, as they multiply and mutate across diverse geographies. And as Kim mentioned, the book is based on ethnographic fieldwork carried out for more than a decade across Palestine, Israel, India, as well as the UK. And I draw in the book on a range of sources, histories, and fragments, tell stories about the transnational connections that brought together people, materials, and places under the banner of homeland security. And through direct engagements with the global homeland security industry over this time, I argue that we can see the ways in which homeland security sort of is made and remade through various forms of relations, and how these relations are sort of forged by actors and interests and woven together in the service of its global mission. And as such, the book theorizes homeland security as a form of what I call world making through circulations of expertise, equipment, and training, but also through the production of different forms of mythologies. And more specifically, I argue that we need to understand homeland security as fabricated. And this notion seeks to capture the relational, politically contested, and geographic process through which homeland security is continuously remade under three distinct but overlapping senses. The first is the literal making of the homeland security state and its surrounding industries, its technology, weapons, logics, etc. And second is the making up of homeland security as a new category and so-called model of governance in the sense of its illusory, mythical, and ideological dimensions. And third is the weaving together of homeland security and the various threads that come to constitute it. And in part because the book develops these claims through a series of stories, in my talk today, I'll focus on three particular stories that help to kind of illustrate the book's broader approach and some of its central arguments. And the first of these stories is the emergence of Israel as a homeland security pioneer and model for the world beginning in the early 2000s. And the second story focuses on the fates of representatives of Israel's homeland security industry in India after 2611. And the final story that I'll kind of wrap the talk up with documents the state and corporate-led efforts to build a new homeland security market in the Indian context after 2008. So as some of you will probably know, Israel's status as a model of homeland security has been destabilized to some extent since October 7, 2023, which is something we can talk about more in the Q&A if people would like. But prior to this moment, Israel's model, as sort of model image, was quite well established, both in scholarship, but also in sort of broader popular culture. And in the book, I trace sort of the origins of this image back to the origins of the colonization of Palestine, beginning in the late 19th century, where Zionist leaders began to mobilize exceptional security narratives to justify their violence against Palestinians to the world. And as I argue in the book, in these early years, the Zionist project was not broadly understood as an exemplary security model to be emulated by the the world's leading powers at the time, even after the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, following the Nakba. But the Six-Day War in 1967 radically transformed Israel's image in the eyes, particularly of the West. Israel's swift military victory over Egypt, Syria, and Jordan proved particularly crucial in cultivating Israel's status as a model of martial prowess for the world to emulate. And the US response to 1967 became particularly difficult. Captivated by Israel's overwhelming display of force, the US incorporated Israel as a strategic asset, a shift that was also sort of bolstered by the influx of military and economic aid, and which continues to this day. And in the years thereafter, Israel's position as a central protagonist in fighting so-called international terrorism continued to gain ground through a series of what anthropologist Melanie McAllister calls epic encounters. And one particularly notable example followed the 1967 hijacking of an Air France flight from Tel Aviv by a group claiming affiliation with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. The hijackers forced the flight to land in Entebbe, Uganda, and demanded that Israel and other countries release other Palestinian and pro-Palestinian hostages. In response, Israel mounted a bold covert rescue operation, flying commandos to Entebbe to successfully rescue all but one of the hostages. The spectacular raid instantly garnered widespread international publicity and valorized Israel's technical capabilities in executing the operation whilst demonizing Palestinians as quintessential terrorist figures. And together, these epic encounters were formative in fabricating the image of Israel as a military and counter-terror model for the world to emulate. And over the decades, these epic encounters worked in tandem with Israeli officials' attempts to explain away controversies surrounding the Zionist colonization of Palestine, land theft and ethnic cleansing, through forms of disavowal underpinned by grammars of imperial exceptionalism. But after the September 11th attacks in 2001, Israel made a concerted effort to position its experience as a precursor to the emerging war of terror. And at the time, Israeli officials went to work making the case that Israelis were the first to have experienced so-called global Islamic terrorism. And Israel, they further claimed, had a demonstrated track record of successfully fighting it. And this strategy to position Israel as a pioneer of domestic security preparedness worked. During the days and weeks after September 11th, during the days and weeks after the September 11th attacks, American state officials and media pundits were repeating claims about Israel's primacy in counterterrorism as gospel. And in Israel, US officials saw an inspiration for the American architecture of domestic surveillance, fortification, and intelligence sharing. But when Israel and its supporters first began to do this in late 2001, the term Homeland Security had not even yet been coined. But within just a few years after the founding of the Department of Homeland Security the following year, Israel's experience was widely understood as coterminous with Homeland Security. And so in the book, I trace how Israelis have laid claim to being Homeland Security pioneers, drawing on ethnographic engagement with Israel's Homeland Security industry over the past decade. This work has involved speaking with key industry actors and engaging with industry forums. And so my Israeli interlocutors made claims about Israel's primacy in developing innovative security approaches and technologies. They suggest that Israel did so before the rest of the world, often by comparing security dynamics of Palestine and Israel with those of other countries framed as behind. And the implication of their narratives was clear. Israelis are Homeland Security pioneers and clairvoyants, giving their global clients tools to manage current dangers and anticipate future developments to remain ahead of the curve. And here, industry actors stressed that their unparalleled experiences made them uniquely situated to know, understand, and manage security threats more effectively than others. And I encountered such claims in my conversation with a man that I call Avi, who, after working with the Israeli Police Special Forces Unit, Yamam, as a fighter and instructors, left to open his own training firm around the year 2000. And I asked Avi how, if at all, his expertise and skills as a trainer are related to conflicts with Palestinians and neighboring countries. He responded by stressing the duration of the so-called Israeli experience is unparalleled anywhere in the world, and this makes Israeli expertise exceptional. When I asked Avi to elaborate, he explained, quote, "We Israelis are having this kind of situation since before the country was born here, meaning that it's become part of our life," end quote. He stresses that this was unique to Israel, arguing that Europeans maybe had 5 to 7 years of similar experience. And these actors thus explain how Israel's embodied experiences produced exceptionally skilled security personnel. And others I spoke to suggest that their exceptional experience produced an exceptional Israeli security brand of Homeland Security know-how. For instance, Ari, a marketing director for a security firm and risk management firm, explained that Israel had decades of experience of violence, claiming, quote, "Our reality creates this brand, and it's an unfortunate reality, an unfortunate brand. But this is what brings, at the end of it, the necessity to have to learn something from this experience," end quote. Claiming the dangers Israeli faced were externally imposed onto them, Ari mobilized the Israeli experience to disavow Israel's responsibility for creating its reality, framing it as natural and both externally imposed. In explaining the appeal of the Israeli Homeland Security brand, my interlocutors also frequently referenced Israel's heightened sense of security awareness. And through such exceptional references, it figures thereby narrate Israel's history of settler colonial conquest as a kind of special case of protracted conflict that exemplifies Homeland Security and therefore can serve as an inspiration to be shared with others, not as an example of violence, but rather as its antithesis. And in describing the Israel brand of Homeland Security, my interlocutors also referenced an Israeli approach and occasionally an Israeli model. When I asked them to elucidate the specificities of this so-called approach, their accounts were far from consistent about what exactly defined it. And to the extent that they could explain its specificity, my interlocutors often resorted to comparisons to security approaches elsewhere. For instance, I asked Eyal, the CEO of an Israeli police counterterrorism training firm, to define his unique training on so-called Islamic culture and Arabic language as offered on his website. And he refused to answer me directly, instead recounting an anecdote about how he was once approached by a police commander in some unspecified European city. As he repeatedly emphasized, quote, "This European country is a very, very, very modern country, even more modern than Israel, okay? A total West European country, the highest of civilizational level," as you quote. He then noted that his European client told him that, quote, "I have a problem, namely the city of more than 1 million people, there were around 50 mosques." And the European official allegedly told Eyal, quote, "I'm basically blind, unable to differentiate between Sunnis and Shiites, let alone which specific mosques or Muslims might be most dangerous." And thus, according to Eyal, the European official therefore asked him to analyze and picture the situations in these mosques. As he explained, quote, "To learn the language of European Muslims, to understand their mentality, and to operate and send agents inside or collect people that can work inside are things that Israel is specialized in." And Eyal continued, quote, "They, Muslims and Arabs, are our cousin. We know our cousin better than anyone else, sometimes even better than they know each other." And so Eyal's account of the value of his expertise to his European client was predicated on the foundation of white supremacy, giving him the knowledge to help his European client decide who is deserving of surveillance, premature death, and assist in beating it out. Thus, while my interlocutors' attempts to define the Israeli approach to homeland security were questionable at best, to the extent that they did define such approach, it was through comparison to and differentiation from others elsewhere, often through explicit use of racialized and civilizational tropes. And so I traced these marketing efforts and their attempt to enroll an international audience of admirers, and in turn mobilize the same audience to fabricate their own worldly credentials. For instance, on the LinkedIn page of one police trainer featured this image of his work visa in the United States, issued in November 2001, as a quote instructor in counterterrorism training, as evidence of his worldly credentials. Indeed, Israeli security firms perform their own exceptionality and universality by referencing their own role in the West civilizing missions. Yet I argue that it's important it's kind of a mistake to overlook this process of exceptionalist narration as kind of logical or straightforward. Obvious claim, for instance, that the very Europeans who provided the Zionist settlers with the materials to carry out the Nakba, controlled large swaths of the globe, and had been pacifying struggles in their own territories for centuries, had but 5 to 7 years of experience fighting so-called terrorism, is utterly laughable. Moreover, there are significant dangers of fetishizing the Israeli brand or approach as stable, coherent, or all-encompassing. The salience and value of Israeliness is contingent, geographically variegated, and needs to be continuously negotiated across different sites, as will become clear in my second story. So although 2611 was hardly India's first experience with large-scale attacks on major cities, homeland security and its associated technologies had remained fairly peripheral in discussions about so-called solutions to such events prior to 2611. And when journalists and state officials did discuss homeland security and so-called models of counterterrorism, including Israel's, they often typically frame these as quintessentially out of place in the Indian context. Yet in the aftermath of 2611, Indian officials' historic reticence to embrace Israeli security approaches were eclipsed by widespread calls for India to quote, wake up and embrace the new paradigm of homeland security. And following this, a number of new collaborations opened up between Israeli and Indian actors. One of these came in July 2009, when a trade promotion body called the Israel Export and International Cooperation Institute organized an official Maharashtra delegation to visit Palestine, Israel. The delegation was led by newly appointed Mumbai Police Commissioner E. Shivanandam and accompanied by senior police officers and representatives of the state government of the state of Maharashtra. The team visited Jerusalem to meet the city's police chief, attended a seminar on secure cities in Tel Aviv, and undertook various field visits, including to Ben Gurion Airport, as well as to the headquarters of various Israeli security firms. And both Israeli organizers and Indian participants I spoke with suggested the primary objective of the delegation was to, quote, showcase Israeli homeland security approaches to these Indian clientele. Guy Zuri, a trade official involved in organizing the delegation, further suggested it proved fruitful, in part because there is an understanding that at least some common domestic security challenges between Israel and India, respectively. Yet Zuri was quick to point out that what happened after the delegation was out of his hand. Once the initial phase of what he called matchmaking was over, we noted that Israeli security companies would be on their own as they took it to the next step and worked out projects with their various Indian clients. And the highly suggested metaphors that Zuri used to describe the delegation are neither new nor incidental. Indeed, efforts to promote conventional weapon sales from Israel to India have long relied on similar terms of reference historically. So in a truly cringe 2009 promotional video from the Israeli weapons firm Rafael depicts some of these images with an Israeli man donning sunglasses and a leather jacket, dancing with Indian women and singing in highly sexualized and gendered language, pledging to build a new, cheap, durable geopolitical relationship. And the 2009 delegation visit also seems to have nurtured a sense of commonality between the various urban security problems between India and Israel, respectively. For instance, when I asked Rahul, a senior police officer who participated in the delegation, what struck him as particularly relevant for Mumbai, he recalled seeing videos of photos of Jerusalem that depicted both skirmishes between Muslims and Jews and the kind of tactics and equipment used to manage these. As you remarked, this is also relevant to our cities also. We have similar kinds of problems here in Mumbai and India. But despite their positive impressions of Israeli security systems, Maharashtra participants generally frame the lessons they derive from the delegation visit in very broad platitudes. And rather than reading the Israeli Homeland Security model as a kind of universal standard or thing to be exported or emulated, Maharashtra officials seem to deduce that Israel's Homeland Security exceptionality was culturally and historically specific and tied to place, making it both immobile and radically out of place in state Maharashtra. And here, Indian delegation participants pointed out, despite some common security problems, the sheer scale of India made its challenges fundamentally different in kind from those faced by Israel. This in turn raised questions about the universality and utility of some Israeli security systems in relation to India. And beginning in 2009, Indian media reported that Israelis were training special units in Mumbai and Maharashtra police. And by speaking with Israeli actors and Indian officials who were involved in these activities, I got a sense of the texture of the encounters and what, if anything, they produced. And certain Maharashtra officials mentioned specific contributions from the Israeli trainers who worked with local forces. One officer spoke of Israeli trainers' expertise in global area intervention, for hostage rescue, disaster management, and urban warfare, as well as some good practices in shooting. And when I spoke to a high-ranking officer in Maharashtra anti-terrorism squad, he maintained that his expertise, equipment, and training, imparted by the Israelis and other foreign experts, fostered a renewed sense of confidence among local forces that had been badly damaged during 26/11. However, the majority of my Indian interlocutors' accounts of foreign training were much more circumspect, troubling the idea of Israeli expertise and models can be sort of smoothly transferred from one location to another. Indeed, while maintaining that Israelis and other foreign training proved useful, the Maharashtra officers I spoke to underscored their own credentials, authority, and sovereignty. One former senior official, who I call Aditya, explained this to me through a story. He recalled that when Israelis arrived in Mumbai to train local forces in 2009, they showed local officers a training video. And in the video, he said, depicted a scenario in which a terrorist suspect with an Arab appearance was intercepted before carrying out a grenade attack in Tel Aviv. And Aditya recalled that he had doubts about the utility of this approach in Indian conditions because, quote, the scale, the magnitude, and numbers in India are very daunting, end quote. And so he then asked the Israeli trainer to accompany him to Mumbai's main rail station, Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, or CST, at rush hour. And Aditya laughed. He recalled that immediately upon observing the scene at CST, the Israeli trainer rather told him, quote, I withdraw my remarks. These things won't work here, end quote. Indeed, a number of Maharashtra officials poked holes in the basis of Israeli claims, universal authority, and its implicit hierarchy. In my conversations with Israelis involved in these same interactions, I also found striking traces of Maharashtrian officers' unwillingness to treat Israelis actors deferentially and commit to working with them. Avi, the trainer we met in the previous story, called out Indian strange attitude and suggested they were not straightforward to deal with. When I asked him about his experience working in India, he remarked, quote, Indians are very complicated persons, very. Their attitude to life is different from us Israelis. First of all, they don't like to pay. Then they think they can copy you. After 5 minutes, they take someone else, I mean another consultant or trainer, and start work. Crazy stuff. Maharashtra police and Israeli trainers disagreed about why they did not develop a durable partnership on homeland security, and some of their accounts are diametrically opposed. Both groups projected sources of difficulty onto the others in ways that preserve their own authority as the norm. But where they agreed was that the encounters were characterized by considerable disagreement about how to approach domestic security. And he also agreed that these differences proved intractable. But what's greatest interest to me in the book is how these interactions on the ground in Maharashtra unsettled Israeli claims to exceptional expertise and the pretense of privileged universal authority. And I find echoes of this lack of deference in the broader efforts by Israel's homeland security industry to, in their words, penetrate India after 26/11. Some Israeli security firms entered India before 2008, but the majority came thereafter, offering a range of things, including small arms, access control systems, gates, fences, surveillance equipment, as well as various forms of consulting expertise in risk management, intelligence, and police training. For instance, BG delineated gates and urban elements for BGI, which manufactures anti-ramming bulwarks, roadblocks, got a contract to install the system outside the Bombay Stock Exchange after 26/11. Yet large-scale and long-term contracts in the public sector in Maharashtra and beyond did not materialize in the way that many Israeli homeland security firms and trade officials had initially proposed. Some Israeli security companies found ways to do business in India, but the majority of firms that I spoke with decided to exit India entirely after just a few years of working after 26/11, based on a combination of economic population, as well as the sheer frustration of interacting with their various Indian counterparts. And in explaining their lack of success in India, my Israeli interlocutors complained about Indians' business culture, mentalities, but also Indian different attitudes and ways of conceptualizing and practicing domestic security. Eyal, who we met in the previous story, recalled that he'd attempted to get work in India after 2008, but quote, like divers, he had a huge tank of oxygen to succeed in diving in the Indian Ocean, as we Israelis say. You need a lot of patience. You need a huge budget for marketing and penetration to the country, and I couldn't. I didn't succeed. My Israeli interlocutors did their best to rationalize their limited success in India as evidence of Indian backwardness. Noam, for instance, a representative of the Israeli firm Athena Security, explained that Indians' apparent lack of interest in the full range of its firm services as evidence of Indians' backwardness and lack of modernity or leadership. Indians, as he told me, quote, are servants in nature. They were born to serve, and they don't feel comfortable at being leaders of anything. But even amid these blatantly racist efforts to explain away their encounters in India, a few Israeli officials were somewhat more introspective, suggesting that their experiences in India fractured their own vanity and troubled their claims to universal expert authority. And I thus argue that we need to pay attention to difference to recover the ways in which incommensurable social orders endure alongside the reproduction of hegemonic projects like security, development, and others. And doing so, I argue, allows us to grapple with how these style projects of universalism attempt to transcend difference, yet without necessarily assuming their capacity to do so in practice. So I now turn to my third and final story, namely the efforts to build an Indian Homeland Security market after 2611. This project involved a loose coalition of actors spanning much of the world, including representatives of the global Homeland Security industry, in concert with Indian state officials and members of India's corporate class, represented primarily by management consultancies and chambers of commerce. And in the wake of 2611, this coalition began to organize a series of policy conferences and trade shows in order to radically refashion India's approach to internal security. And I carried out participant observation across a range of these events within India and the UK, beginning in 2012. These events were often accompanied by publications such as market reports, white papers, and surveys. And within these industry discourses, 2611 was staged as a kind of paradigm shift of India's threat perception and its appetite for homeland security. Industry texts proclaimed that 2611 made visible new domestic security threats, which in turn fostered greater appreciation for homeland security by the Indian state, Indian capital, and civil society, employing a kind of familiar economic, neoliberal economic reasoning. They made the case for viewing terrorist attacks as a major threat to India's overall economic stability, arguing that post-2611, India could no longer afford not to invest more in homeland security if it wished to maintain its status as a vibrant economy on the world stage. However, they also started a number of challenges and various impasses that stood in their way. In response, industry actors proposed various strategies to overcome these self-described challenges of Indian homeland security, with one conference I attended taking this as its title. And unsurprisingly, such events focus on boosting demand for homeland security in India by flooding the country with new products and services and showcasing them to potential buyers. In industry parlance, this work is often framed as educating the Indian market, as well as in terms of raising awareness, processes whereby potential customers are exposed to new security solutions, and as a result, become aware of their self-implied necessity and desirability. For instance, Security Watch India, a Delhi-based corporate lobby group, was founded in 2009 to spearhead India's homeland security revolution. And its website at the time explained its objectives as follows, quote, "Our mission is to assist in the transformation of the India homeland security apparatus to meet the challenges by bringing new technologies, training methods, and awareness through the involvement of international homeland security industry." And to do so, Homeland Security Watch India organized a circuit of conferences and trade shows like its flagship Securing Asia Abroad, beginning in 2012, to exhibit the Indian homeland security market as ripe for international engagement. The 3-day-long event focused presentations by speakers, including vendors, giving them the platforms to extol the virtues of their products and services and the kinds of problems that they could resolve. And educating the market and raising awareness, however, went beyond simply showcasing new kind of modern homeland security solutions to India and Indians. Industry events also provided advice, competencies, and expertise on how networking should be approached and carried out. In his address at Securing Asia 2012, a leading Indian business consultant spoke on the current state of the Indian business environment. And he repeatedly stressed that in India, quote, nothing is how you see it, end quote. He claimed that although the country holds immense commercial opportunities as a homeland security export market, it is a deceptive environment with slippery and unscrupulous Indian agents and partners waiting to, quote, screw you along the way. And as a potential solution, these events thereby provided advice about how to network and collaborate more profitably by overcoming various forms of cultural barriers. In the Securing Asia 2012 event guide, this diagram suggested that networking was a key part of realizing its core mission of linking Asian security buyers and the global homeland security suppliers. But in the same diagram, successful networking was presented as kind of contingent upon the pre-existing knowledge of the so-called Asian legal framework and how to do business in Asia. And these references to cultural competency and means of overcoming cultural difference represented as kind of utilitarian strategies to overcome the key challenges of networking successfully in India and Asia more broadly. Yet crucially, this cultural knowledge is represented in industry discourses as both necessary but insufficient condition for securing India. This mission was also about transforming Indians' awareness about and appreciation for homeland security as a kind of new paradigm of governance. And industry discourses framed awareness raising as key to cultivating different dispositions and subjectivities of Indians vis-a-vis homeland security. This imperative involves self-conscious efforts to educate Indians about the meaning and value of homeland security as a kind of new paradigm of governance, sometimes styled in the language of educating a new Indian homeland security subject. This subject resembles the figure that Mark Neocloud calls Homo Securitas, a quintessentially neoliberal entrepreneurial citizen subject of man with a soul committed to security. But crucially, however, these same boosters suggest that educating an Indian version of this subject require overcoming Indian tradition, backwardness in culture, by re-educating so-called Indian mind, as well as in addressing enduring Western misconceptions about India. And this focus on the Indian mind is a recurring theme at Securing Asia 2012. The event was self-consciously styled as a so-called cerebral platform for overcoming a range of cultural barriers and worldviews that stood in the way of India's homeland security revolution. Securing Asia's cerebral focus is also manifested in its organizational structure, with substantial programming time devoted to intercivilizational debates on the key challenges facing in the future of India and Asia. And these sessions sought to debunk various myths inherent in Western views on security by giving a kind of authentic space for authentic Western, Asian, or Indian perspectives to emerge. And while such presentations often lack concrete conclusions, the general takeaway was that although changing mindsets and beliefs was crucial to securing Asia, this could not be realized by simply imposing Western security perspectives onto Indians. They intimated that Indians would no longer be seen as passive recipients of Western knowledge. And this speaks to what I call in the book the politics of post-colonial difference. This refers to the multiple, elastic, and sometimes contradictory ways in which difference is deployed by asserting claims of identity, nationhood, and sovereignty, as well as authority. But such references to difference also speaks to the implications of this forms of difference with forms of Indian exceptionalism and Hindu exceptionalism. So what does this all tell us about how the efforts to remake India and Indians played out in the age of homeland security after 2008? So at the events that I attended, there was a palpable sense of excitement about the prospect of replicating Western homeland security in India. Yet notably, not all Indian state officials present at such events necessarily sounded like pacified subjects of Homo Securitas, lining up to be educated, at least not on the terms dictated to them by the global homeland security industry. And during security such events, Indian state officials often explicitly challenged various industry tropes. Some questioned whether an influx of new perspectives, ideas, and modern technologies offered quick technical fixes to structural deficiencies of India's domestic security infrastructure. Others further pushed back against the suggestion that Indian police needed some kind of re-education, or even that the West represented the standard to be striven for. And in the book, I suggested Indian state officials' objections to industry tropes show how security boosters' attempts to educate the subject of Indian homeland security ultimately came up short. And I argue that these reflects the existence of the different subjectivities, one that refused to fully capitulate Western actors and Indian corporate allies' expected terms of engagement. And I further suggested that carefully, Indian state officials' skepticism about homeland security helped to unsettle the self-implied universality of homeland security knowledge, but also its subject-oriented epistemology and modernity, undergirding the same efforts to export it to the Indian context. So I now turn to some of the book's conclusions. As the book argues in various ways, homeland security is really just a matter of the homeland. I show how the various efforts to remake India and Indians in the image of homeland security after 2611 partly came to fruition and did important kinds of work. This includes the media production of 2611 as an exceptional geopolitical event and moment, which signaled India's ostensible record need for homeland security solutions in the first place. In the years after 2611, homeland security's global mission has served some global and Indian constituencies rather well. Local state actors were able to police the crisis of authority that 2611 gave rise to under the banner of police modernization quite effectively, whereby new high-tech instruments of policing and surveillance were armed against charges of weakness and incompetence. If the mission to remake India and Indians in the image of homeland security did not materialize in the way that many, including Israelis, expected or desired they would. Despite all their efforts to exploit 2611 as a moment of opportunity, the Israeli homeland security industry's efforts to therefore penetrate India mostly came up short, as did Indian capital's broader strategies to educate a new Indian homeland security market in the image of the modern West. And to the extent that homeland security has materialized in place, for instance, in the city of Mumbai, it is done so in highly ad hoc, patchy, and sometimes rather questionable ways. For instance, these scanners purchased after 2611 were installed at CST. But as you can see in the image here, one will be able to easily walk around them if one so desired. And over time, these material manifestations of these efforts to remake India and Indians in the image of homeland security have also taken some quite telling shifts. When some aspects of the early physical response to 2611 have remained in place, others in the city have undergone modification in highly improvised fashion, as seen in the remaking of security infrastructure at the Bombay Stock Exchange. On one of my follow-up visits to the site in 2019, I observed contractors taking apart the structures and modifying them with these handheld metal grinders. And on the same visit to the site, I also noticed that although certain parts of the BGI logo still remain intact, the systems were still there, the logos have since been erased with the same metal grinders. So although the system had been purchased from an Israeli firm to project an image of modern homeland security competence at the center of India's financial capital in 2009, in the intervening decade, the respective Indianness and Israeliness of these same products remained kind of an open question. And so based on these findings, the book therefore works to unsettle homeland security as a kind of coherent and all-encompassing universal project. I argue that we're read carefully, efforts to fabricate in homeland security in India offer new ways to unsettle the notion of homeland security and models thereof, which go beyond abstract critique. When we pay attention to the strategies that fold India into global war and terror as a kind of singular totality, we repeatedly encounter enactments of multiple, sometimes rather incompatible worlds or reals, reflecting global incommensurability between places and peoples, but also between security regimes themselves. And attention to these rifts and tensions, I argue, can help to destabilize the universal credentials, not merely of homeland security, but security at large as a kind of global project, global pacification. So I'll leave it there, but thanks so much.